Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. I've always considered myself a reasonable guy, the kind who follows rules, pays taxes on time, and generally tries to be a good neighbor. My name is Michael, and after 15 years in the corporate grind as an electrical engineer, I'd finally saved enough to buy my dream property. 2 acres of beautiful land in the prestigious Whispering Pines development, complete with a private pond and a small wooded area at the back. Yes, the homeowners association had strict rules, but the listing agent assured me they were just the standard stuff to maintain property values. I reviewed the covenant, found nothing objectionable, and signed on the dotted line. For the first year, everything was picture perfect. I built my custom home, carefully landscaped the grounds, and even added some discrete solar panels that the HOA board approved after I demonstrated they wouldn't be visible from a street. I attended the quarterly meetings, paid my dues promptly, and maintained my property meticulously. My neighbors seemed pleasant enough, though most kept to themselves in the way that people with money and privacy concerns often do. Then everything changed when Elaine Cartwright was elected as the new HOA president. Elaine was new to the community, having moved in just 6 months earlier. She'd campaigned aggressively for the position, promising to elevate Whispering Pines to the premier development in the county. What that actually meant became clear at her first meeting as president when she unveiled her community enhancement initiative. Whispering Pines shouldn't just be a collection of houses, she announced to the assembled homeowners. It should be a true community with shared spaces and amenities that bring us all together. That sounded reasonable enough until she started detailing the plan. The HOA would reclaim certain underutilized portions of various properties for community use, creating walking trails, picnic areas, and even a community garden. My stomach dropped when I saw my property highlighted on her presentation map, with nearly half an acre around my pond marked as Phase 1 Community Nature Area. When a meeting opened for questions, I raised my hand immediately. "Excuse me, but that's my private property you're designating as community land." I never agreed to this. Elaine gave me a condescending smile. "Actually, Michael, if you'll check Section 12, subsection D of the covenant, the HOA reserves the right to designate limited common areas for community enhancement with appropriate compensation to affected homeowners." I was stunned. I'd read the covenant thoroughly and didn't recall any such provision. I'll need to review that. What exactly would appropriate compensation entail? "The board is proposing a 10% reduction in your annual dues," she replied smoothly, "which is more than fair considering the minimal impact and the benefit to your property value from this community improvement." Minimal impact? You're talking about strangers having access to my backyard, my pond. That's a significant privacy and security issue. The area would be accessible only to Whispering Pines residents during daylight hours, and we'd install appropriate signage and path markers to ensure visitors respect the boundaries. Several other homeowners, seemingly entranced by Elaine's vision, looked around for allies and found few. The owners whose properties weren't targeted appeared indifferent or actively supportive. Only a couple of others whose land had been marked seemed concerned, but they remained silent. "I need to consult my attorney about this," I said finally. "Of course," Elaine replied with manufactured graciousness. "We'll be proceeding with preliminary planning. In the meantime, the full implementation is scheduled for next month's meeting." I left that meeting in a daze, covenant in hand, already dialing my real estate attorney. This couldn't possibly be legal, could it? As it turned out, the provision did exist, buried in dense legalese and cross-referenced with other sections in a way that made its full implications nearly impossible for a non-lawyer to comprehend. My attorney, Marcus, didn't mince words. "This is unusually broad authority for an HOA," he admitted, "but it was disclosed in the covenant you signed. They do have to provide reasonable compensation, though 10% off your dues is laughable for what they're proposing. So, I can't stop them?" I asked, disheartened. "I didn't say that," Marcus replied. "The covenant gives them the right to designate areas, but it also specifies that any modifications must comply with local zoning laws, safety regulations, and property ordinances. That gives us room to maneuver. Over the next 3 weeks, I researched frantically while observing disturbing developments. Small flags appeared along the proposed path through my property. A surveyor showed up one morning without notice, claiming the HOA had authorized him to mark boundaries. I politely but firmly asked him to leave. Then I received an officially looking letter detailing the community nature area implementation schedule, which included dates for fence removal, path installation, and bench placement, all starting just 2 weeks after the upcoming vote. They weren't just planning. They were assuming approval was a mere formality. The breaking point came when I arrived home to find Elaine herself in my backyard with 2 other board members, gesturing toward my pond and discussing what sounded like plans for a dock. When she saw me approaching, she didn't even have the grace to look embarrassed. "Oh, Michael, perfect timing. We were just discussing the potential for a small observation deck over there." She pointed toward the western edge of the pond. "It would have minimal environmental impact and provide a wonderful spot for residents to enjoy the water." I took a deep breath, fighting to maintain my composure. "You're trespassing on private property. All of you need to leave immediately." "Immediately? There's no need for hostility," Elaine replied, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "As HOA board members, we have inspection rights for community planning purposes. Show me in the covenant where it says you can enter my property without notice or permission, because unless you can produce that documentation right now, you're trespassing and I'll call the sheriff." The other board members looked uncomfortable, but Elaine merely sighed as though dealing with a difficult child. "We'll schedule a proper inspection with notice then. But this uncooperative attitude isn't helping anyone, Michael. The community enhancements will proceed regardless." That night, I could barely sleep. The audacity, the entitlement of these people to simply decide my private property was now community land. It was infuriating. But anger wouldn't solve this. I needed to be strategic. The next morning, I called Marcus with a new plan. "I want to install a security fence around my property, something that complies with HOA rules but makes their community nature area impossible." Marcus was silent for a moment. "The covenant does allow for security fencing with board approval. They'd likely deny your application under the circumstances, but there's something else they can't easily block: agricultural designation." "Agricultural? My property isn't a farm. It doesn't need to be." Marcus explained that state law has protections for agricultural land use that supersede most HOA restrictions. If you maintain even a small area for agricultural purposes, say a few beehives or some livestock, you gain certain rights, including appropriate fencing to protect your agricultural investment. This was the loophole I needed. Over the next week, I submitted paperwork to register part of my property for agricultural use. I ordered 2 beehives and arranged for them to be delivered and set up by a local apiarist. I also purchased 4 pygmy goats from a nearby farm, small, gentle creatures that would technically qualify as livestock without requiring extensive care. With my agricultural credentials in order, I contacted a specialty fencing company. They understood exactly what I needed: a perfectly legal electric fence designed for livestock containment. Not the high-voltage kind that would seriously harm someone, but with enough juice to deliver a memorable shock to anyone who ignored the warning signs. The fence installation began 3 days before the HOA vote. It was a substantial investment, nearly $20,000 for the specialized equipment, professional installation, and premium materials. But protecting my property was worth every penny. The fence consisted of sturdy posts with multiple strands of wire enclosing the entirety of my agricultural area, which just happened to include the pond and wooded section the HOA had their eyes on. Bright yellow warning signs were posted every 15 feet. "Caution, electric fence, agricultural protection area, no trespassing." The reaction was immediate. Doorbell. Within hours of the installation crew setting up, Elaine stood on my porch, face flushed with anger, 2 other board members flanking her like enforcers. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "You've installed an electric fence without HOA approval. This is a direct violation." I smiled pleasantly and handed her a folder containing copies of all my documentation. "Actually, I've registered part of my property for agricultural use." State law permits appropriate security measures to protect livestock and agricultural investments. You'll find all the relevant legal citations and permits in here. She flipped through the papers with increasing agitation. Bees? Goats? This is clearly a deliberate attempt to circumvent the Community Enhancement Initiative. I've discovered a passion for sustainable living, I replied with mock earnestness. The honey and goat cheese will be wonderful additions to my lifestyle, and of course, I need to protect my investments from predators, both animal and human. Her eyes narrowed at the implication. This fence is dangerous and violates our community aesthetic standards. The board will not approve this. The board doesn't have the authority to disapprove it, I countered. Agricultural use has specific protections under state law that supersede HOA regulations. The fence meets all safety standards and is properly marked with warnings. Anyone who ignores those warnings and trespasses does so at their own risk. We'll see about that, Elaine snapped, storming back to her waiting compatriots. The legal committee will review this immediately. Please do, I called after her. And while they're at it, have them review trespassing laws as well. The next morning brought another surprise. A cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney demanding I remove the fence immediately. Marcus reviewed it and laughed. They're bluffing, he assured me. They know the agricultural exemption is solid. This is just intimidation. We responded with our own letter detailing the legal basis for the fence, the properly registered agricultural status, and a counter warning about HOA interference with legally protected agricultural activities. For good measure, we added a Freedom to Farm Act citation and a reference to the substantial penalties for trying to prevent legitimate agricultural operations. The scheduled HOA vote was awkward, to say the least. When Elaine unveiled the updated community enhancement map, my property had been conspicuously removed from Phase 1. She made no mention of the change, but the tension in the room was palpable. During the open comment period, I raised my hand. When acknowledged reluctantly by Elaine, I stood to address the assembly. I'd like to invite all interested residents to a beekeeping demonstration next Saturday at my property. The agricultural advisor will explain the environmental benefits of honeybees and proper safety around hives. Children, welcome with adult supervision. Please just use the front gate. The agricultural security fence is for your protection. The look on Elaine's face was worth every cent I'd spent on the fence. Several homeowners actually seemed genuinely interested in the beekeeping demonstration, asking questions and noting the time in their phones. What I couldn't have anticipated was the ripple effect my stand would create. Within days, 3 other homeowners whose properties had been marked for community enhancement contacted me privately, asking about the agricultural designation process. Apparently, one was already considering raising chickens, and another had always wanted to try growing specialty crops. The community began to divide, not dramatically, but noticeably. Many residents remained indifferent, but a vocal group supported Elaine's vision of communal spaces, while another contingent became increasingly concerned about property rights and HOA overreach. The first incident with the fence happened about 2 weeks later. My security cameras caught 2 board members approaching the fence line, apparently testing whether it was actually electrified by touching it with a stick. When nothing happened, one of them reached out to touch the wire directly and quickly discovered that the fence was indeed fully functional. The shock wasn't dangerous, but it was certainly effective. He jumped back with a yelp that was clearly audible on the recording. The second incident was more concerning. I returned home to find Elaine and a man in a municipal uniform examining my electrical box. When confronted, she claimed they were investigating reports of code violations related to the electric fence. The man turned out to be a city electrical inspector who had been misled about the purpose of the visit. Elaine had reported a potentially dangerous electrical installation without specifying it was a properly permitted agricultural fence. After I showed him the permits and installation documentation, the inspector confirmed everything was up to code and left. Elaine remained defiant. This is not over, Michael. That fence is a hazard and an eyesore. The board has a responsibility to protect the community. The fence is legal, properly marked, and serves a legitimate purpose, I responded calmly. If anyone from the HOA tampers with it, disables it, or trespasses past it again, I'll press charges and file for an injunction. Try me. She departed with a huff, but I immediately contacted Marcus to document the incident. We sent another stern letter to the HOA board warning against further harassment or misrepresentation to municipal officials. The beekeeping demonstration was surprisingly well attended. About 20 neighbors showed up, genuinely interested in the process. The apiarist was excellent, explaining the environmental benefits of honeybees and proper safety around hives. Even a few children attended with their parents, fascinated by the beekeeper's protective gear. In the glimpse into the hives throughout the demonstration, I noticed Elaine parked down the street, watching from her car, but never approaching. It was petty vindication, but vindication nonetheless. Over the next few months, an interesting transformation occurred. Two other properties in Whispering Pines erected agricultural fences after establishing their own small agricultural operations. The HOA board became increasingly divided on the Community Enhancement Initiative, with several members questioning the legal and practical implications of attempting to repurpose private property. The tension came to a head at the quarterly meeting 3 months later. Attendance was unusually high, with many homeowners curious about the ongoing conflict. When Elaine attempted to introduce Phase 2 of the initiative, targeting different properties now that the original targets had protected themselves, a board member I had rarely heard speak raised her hand. Before we proceed, I move that we reevaluate the legal basis for designating private property as community land, she said firmly. Several homeowners have expressed valid concerns, and our legal expenses have increased significantly due to conflicts over this issue. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Another board member seconded the motion. Elaine looked like she'd swallowed something sour. This initiative is crucial for enhancing our community profile, she insisted. Every premier development has community amenities. Then perhaps we should focus on actual community property, suggested another homeowner. The HOA owns that 3-acre parcel at the entrance that's just sitting empty except for the sign. Why not develop that instead of trying to take pieces of our private property? The suggestion gained immediate traction. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to temporarily suspend the Community Enhancement Initiative and form a committee to explore alternatives using existing common areas. Elaine's influence waned rapidly after that. She remained HOA president until her term ended 6 months later, but wasn't reelected. The new president, a retired judge named Harold, took a much more measured approach to community improvement movements, focusing on enhancing genuinely common areas and respecting private property boundaries. As for me, I discovered I actually enjoyed my small agricultural pursuits. The honey from my beehives was exceptional, and the pygmy goats became beloved pets that kept the grass trimmed in their enclosure. I maintained the electric fence. It had served its purpose in protecting my property rights, but now it genuinely protected my agricultural investments as well. Elaine eventually sold her house and moved away, reportedly to a development with a more progressive approach to community planning. Harold made a point of revising the HOA covenant to clarify and limit the limited common areas provision, requiring explicit owner consent and fair market compensation. Any private property used for community purposes. The irony wasn't lost on me that Elaine's aggressive overreach had ultimately led to stronger property protections for everyone in Whispering Pines. Sometimes it takes an electric fence to shock people into recognizing boundaries, both literal and figurative. During the following spring's community picnic, held on the newly landscaped actual common area near the entrance, Harold approached me with a glass of lemonade. You know, your stand against Elaine's land grab was the catalyst for some important changes around here, he said quietly. That agricultural exemption was clever. I smiled. Just protecting what's mine while trying to be a good neighbor. Sometimes those goals align perfectly. Indeed they do, he agreed. By the way, my wife was wondering if you might have any of that honey available for purchase. She says it's the best she's ever tasted. No purchase necessary. I laughed. Good neighbors get it for free. I'll drop some by tomorrow. As I looked around at the community gathering, people chatting amicably, children playing, everyone enjoying the properly designated common area, I felt a profound satisfaction. My electrified fence still hummed quietly around my property, a constant reminder that sometimes the best way to be part of a community is to first establish clear boundaries. And as for Elaine Cartwright and her community enhancement initiative, well, sometimes the best revenge is simply protecting what's yours and watching justice unfold, naturally with just enough electrical current to make the point stick.